Welcome to a Newsline special report. Today is October 26th. I'm Palakiko Chandler.
And I'm Allison Caffrey. It's been 50 years since the Kerner Commission warned America about the dangers of racism and segregation.
Today we join with Morgan State University and West Virginia University to provide you with more than 4 hours of coverage on race relations in America.
This is the Kerner Plus 50. In the mid-60s, the country was rocked by an increasing number of race riots.
President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered a report to get to the bottom of these issues.
Since most of us didn't live through it, understanding the significance of that report isn't exactly easy.
Newsline reporter Jasmine Haroni is with us to keep it all into context. Jasmine, at the heart of the issue, what is the Kerner report?
Well, I have it here with me. This is a 68 edition of the report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, a U.S. bestseller at the time. It's not exactly a catchy title, so why were Americans so eager to read it? Here's the history. They called it the long, hot summer of 1967. Over the span of a few months, more than 160 race riots broke out all over the nation.
Looting was very widespread. Among broken glass, bricks, torn up pavement, looted stores.
The tension of the civil rights movement had reached a breaking point. The week following the two worst riots in Newark, New Jersey and Detroit, Michigan, President Lyndon B. Johnson made a phone call and then 10 more.
John.
Hello, Mr. President.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you, sir.
One of these was to Mayor John Lindsay of New York.
I want nothing but competence, and I want nothing but compassion, and I want nothing but patriotism.
In an address to the nation the next day, the president introduced the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, commonly known as the Kerner Commission.
Otto Kerner of Illinois has agreed to serve as chairman.
Governors, mayors, and other leaders, two of which were black, made up the bipartisan commission. Over the next 7 months, they investigated, interviewed, and surveyed in 23 of the cities where the riots had occurred. They were to answer 3 simple questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And what can be done to prevent it from happening again? Once published, the report was wildly popular and sold 740,000 copies in the first 3 weeks. So what had happened, and why? The report's biggest finding was that the riots were not planned defiance against government, as some had thought.
It took the appearance of 14,000 troops to bring an end to what both Negro and white leaders called insurrection by hoodlums.
The commission found that blacks living in the ghettos were upset about police practices, unemployment, inadequate housing and education, and disrespectful white attitudes. In short, the riots were a cry for help. So what could be done? Policies and programs came as the answer. The Kerner Commission made hundreds of recommendations on the federal, state, and local level. They asked Congress to create 2 million jobs in 3 years. They asked cities to create better training for their police officers to better preserve human life. And from the average American, they asked for new attitudes, new understanding, and above all, new will.
We will stop it. And let us build something much more lasting. Faith between man and man. Faith between race and race. Faith in each other. And faith in the promise of beautiful America.
The Kerner Commission concluded their report with these words. We have provided an honest beginning. We have learned much, but we have uncovered no startling truths, no unique insights, no simple solutions.
They sure got that right. No simple solutions. Thank you, Jasmine.
In the 50 years since that report, the print and electronic media have made significant changes in the way that minorities are represented in newspapers, magazines, television, and film. Reporter Berto Sanchez did some archive digging. Berto, what did you find out?
Media has contributed in shaping how we see minorities. Words and verbiage used in the past 50 years has changed dramatically since the release of the report.
They rushed the 39-year-old Negro leader to a hospital where he died of a bullet wound in the neck.
In 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, some of the words used in reports were racist and politically incorrect. Those terms are heard in network TV broadcasts and in newspapers from the day.
The way media portrays people affects that underlying racism. In general, media has changed to be both more sensitive towards the fact that sometimes people of color are left out of representations, or white folks are normalized like that we only see white people as heroes of the story.
There has been an evolution on the depiction of minorities in media. For example, ads created in the 70s by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were very whitewashed. The commercial depicts only the stereotypical Caucasian family. In recent years, the church has reached out to highlight the diversity of church membership. Ads created over the past 30 years have become more racially diverse. The ads indicate the church's increased understanding of diversity and inclusion of minority groups.
Within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there is a growing awareness and concern with the fundamental problem of racism. Like a lot of American society, it also is trying to become aware of and respond to the underlying racism that has created so many problems in American history, and try to respond to that in a constructive way that allows people to come together, especially within the church, in a way that looks towards an eternal future that won't be driven by these kinds of conflicts, but can be driven more by what we believe in, which is charity, love, compassion, a willingness to see all people as brothers and sisters.
Media plays a huge role in shaping our perception of reality. When media creates a more unbiased view of minorities, it is possible to diminish the stereotypes that are attributed to them and create an atmosphere that is almost free of prejudice. Back to you.
In Search for Solutions, lawyer and activist Bryan Stevenson opened up a museum and memorial in April, located in Montgomery, Alabama. It is dedicated to people terrorized by lynching. Newsline reporter Christian Torres tells us how BYU advertising students have taken to the task to promote the memorial and how that task has changed them.
Before graduation, a traditional advertising student at BYU might choose to do their final project creating an advertising campaign for, say, Nike shoes or Coca-Cola. But this year, a group of seniors have decided that their capstone project should have a little more meaning.
One of the main reasons why I love advertising and why I wanted to do it was to be able to make a difference.
Meet the team whose final project is to promote the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, a site dedicated to people terrorized by lynching. The team is all white.
Down here by the tower, where the route is.
For the past few weeks, the team has been working on researching how students at BYU, a predominantly all-white campus, feel about talking about topics concerning race relations. Their findings? BYU students tend to shy away from race, but they feel more comfortable if their conversation is centered on a figure involved in race relations. And that figure of interest lately is Bryan Stevenson.
They really found Bryan Stevenson to be interesting. They loved the topics and things that he discussed, but also his accomplishments.
Stevenson is scheduled to make a guest appearance at BYU next week to give a forum address on his Equal Justice Initiative. And the ad students are taking advantage of this opportunity to run an ad campaign on campus promoting the forum. If this mini campaign works, they'll use the same methods in a much larger scale for the real project, promoting the memorial in Alabama.
This poster we put all around campus. We have digital versions.
The team is using every modern technique to raise awareness about Stevenson's forum next week.
The first thing they see is Bryan's TED Talk.
If these students weren't originally interested in the topic of race, most of them are now.
I think it kind of just opened my eyes to the diversity that is in our country because, you know, I've never really lived in a super diverse world.
The students' ultimate goal is to design a campaign advertising the Montgomery Memorial, but they recognize that even the efforts they make on campus can help other students change their perspective on race.
That is something that I want people to get out of it, is not to kind of step back from the issue and kind of say, oh, that's not my world, I don't have anything to do with that, I don't want to hear about it, but to kind of own it and say, okay, we as a country have a problem here and I'm now aware of it, and what can I do as an individual to help it?
For Newsline, I'm Christian Torres.
Here on the campus of Brigham Young University, there's a lack of diversity among students and faculty.
Newsline reporter Katie Karras is on BYU's campus. Katie, how are students coming together to bring unity to those who feel alone?
Here at BYU, it's not uncommon for students of color to feel out of place, but there are a variety of clubs across campus that are trying to change that.
Yeah, civil rights. Look at that. Social justice.
Meet Kira.
Just right on my face.
Your typical college student trying to balance school, work, and a minor obsession with British pop stars.
I love Harry Styles, no shame.
But on the campus of Brigham Young University, Kira is far from typical.
Everyone's white.
And even before coming to BYU, Kira knew she was unique.
We are not your traditional family. It's kind of like a this is us situation.
As the oldest of 3 adopted children raised by white parents, Kira always felt accepted,
But it wasn't until she started elementary school that she started to feel different from those around her.
Like if you look through all my yearbook pictures, like in elementary school, I'm the only one in every class.
Never had her skin color mattered.
For all those kids to stare at me, it was really uncomfortable because I was like, I am just like you. I go home to white parents, my grandparents are white, my cousins are all white, so I'm not different.
After graduating high school, Kira moved to Oahu to attend BYU Hawaii, and from there to London, with internship experiences taking her to New York and even Los Angeles. So when she moved back to Utah to finish school in Provo, it was a shock.
Really hard to deal with, especially when you move back from a super diverse place where everyone is mixed race, comes from all different types of ethnic backgrounds, different cultures are always celebrated, so it's really a crazy experience to come to a place that is so vanilla.
According to the university, nearly 82% of BYU's campus is Caucasian, and in a recent study done by WalletHub found that out of Utah's top 4 colleges, BYU ranked last for diversity. But there is a place on campus that Kira feels she can fit in, through clubs like the Black Student Union.
So the Black Student Union is just a place where students of color can come to feel safe. It's a place where we can have fun together and kind of be around people that we can relate to.
The BYU Student Association says the purpose of the club is to intellectually, socially, and culturally enrich the college's campus. But to its members, it means so much more.
Because here, being a minority, it's hard to find a group per se, especially people you feel comfortable around.
The club offers activities and other ways for students to connect. But BSU isn't the only place. The Women of Color Club is one Kira feels personally connected to.
Some of the most intelligent, eloquent, and amazing women I've met in that club.
Other opportunities for students include the Civil Rights Seminar, aimed at providing students with knowledge and skills to improve race relations in the United States. A mixed group of BYU students who spend time touring historical sites related to the civil rights movement.
That was probably the most spiritual experience I've ever had in my life.
BYU is providing opportunities for everyone to feel like they belong. And for students like Kira, a place to find unity.
Comforting to know and be validated in my experiences, because I think for a lot of people, for most of my life, I felt very isolated.
And while remembering back to experiences in her past, Kira says she's hopeful for the future.
Things are definitely changing. I think our generation gives me a lot of hope, I think, so that makes me kind of excited to be a part of it.
In addition to BSU and the Women of Color Club, there are nearly 30 other clubs across campus. You can find out more about these groups and how they're making a difference at clubs.byu.edu. Back to you.
Thanks, Katie. According to the NCAA, 47% of college football players are black. However, here at BYU, that number's only 15%. Newsline reporter Adam Gibby found out that across all the sports, BYU has a much lower percentage of black athletes compared to the national average. Adam, you spoke with several of those minority student athletes?
Yes, I spoke with many athletes and coaches, and they all seem to have a very similar story. And let's just say it doesn't follow the typical stereotype.
Here's what many think of when they think of Brigham Young University. Black students make up 0.5% of the BYU population, compared to an estimated 16% of college students nationwide. The majority of these black students at BYU are athletes.
Steps up, on the move, downfield.
As one may imagine, it may be a culture shock when minority athletes come to Provo for the first time. Senior sprinter Keisha Miller is from Bermuda and is not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She says the first time she stepped foot in Provo was during her freshman orientation.
When I first got here to BYU, I just remember thinking, wow, there's a real lack of diversity.
Despite being a minority on campus, many feel at home. Micah Simon, a junior receiver for the football team, says that despite being from Fort Worth, Texas, a city where nearly 20% of the population is black, Simon feels at home here in Provo.
I look at all people, the same and equal, and that's how I want to live my life and spread positivity.
School administrators and coaches are trying to make athletes feel like they belong.
More diverse now than it was. What was that? Pretty much 20 years ago now. Being here is actually a great thing. People kind of take you in and treat you like family.
One reason minority athletes may feel welcome is because many students have served church missions all around the world. 63% of BYU students have served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, many of whom served in areas where they became the minority themselves.
As a mission, I went and served in southern Mexico, and I went from a very middle-class background, predominantly white community, to being one of the only white people in the area.
Despite the perceptions of BYU, athletes are finding a home away from home.
Once we're all together, it's all a brotherhood, it's all family, and everybody just feels welcome.
Coaches and administrators tell me that BYU is always searching for ways to be more inclusive and welcoming to all athletes by having clubs, activities, and by recruiting from around the world. Reporting for Newsline, I'm Adam Gibby.
Cameron McCoy is one of the few African-American professors here at Brigham Young University. During his undergraduate studies, he did not like the lack of racial diversity here in Provo. Newsline reporter Carmen Kodia is here today. Carmen, the history professor, is here at BYU to break racial stereotypes.
That's right, Polikiko. It's been 16 years since McCoy graduated, and now, back on campus, his goal is to teach students how to act and think differently on social issues.
Intense, focused, dependable.
Those three words best describe Cameron McCoy. The Washington, D.C. native remembers his childhood as challenging but rewarding.
You know what, learning how to navigate in a poor working class neighborhood, learning how to navigate through violence in D.C., those are all serious challenges.
After graduating from BYU, he served his country by becoming a Marine Guard.
As a kid, just believed it was important to serve and fight for my nation. It truly was a calling. I felt at a young age it was what I was meant to do. I remember getting commissioned in the Marine Corps. That was really important. I served as a rifle platoon commander, company commander, and things like that. And I really remember always wanting to be a lieutenant colonel, and that happened. And so those are things that I look at and I'm really, happy about and pleased about.
After his service, McCoy realized education was also a top priority.
Making it through school, being successful in school, was the most important thing.
That's what you all do to me. McCoy was very successful, earning his master and doctorate degrees.
So I can only speak from my standpoint. When I was a student here, I would have loved to have seen professors of African descent. I never saw that while I was here.
Inequality is still prevalent in our society.
How does that topic always come up when it comes to the United States? And if we just look back to the founding of the nation, it was founded on inequality. And I think that's rooted. As a matter of fact, I know it's rooted in the identity of the United States. I do believe that the nation has improved. The fact that you and I are sitting here and having this interview on a college campus. Just a statement, kind of like...
McCoy says he came back to BYU because he felt an obligation to give back to the school that had helped him in his career.
In my class, I want them to gain greater empathy for diverse groups. I want them to do their best to break away from a homogenous way of thinking. I want them to be more globally minded and understand that they play a critical role in not only the mission of BYU, but their mission as Christians and as saints. That's really the best part, is getting students to continue the conversation.
Dr. McCoy teaches history and hopes more people will recognize the importance of diversity in society.
Carmen, how do students at BYU like Dr. McCoy's teaching philosophy?
They love it. He helps his students. He has high expectations for his students, but he helps them to reach them. Dr. McCoy is humble and wants his students to succeed.
Thanks, Carmen.
A professor has partnered with a library at the University of Utah and with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to develop a database that shares the history of African American members of the Latter-day Saint faith. Newsline reporter Cameron Hussein has more on the story.
Century of Black Mormons is a digital history database. It documents and recovers identities and voices of African American Latter-day Saints during the faith's first 100 years. Paul Reeve, the head of the project and a history professor at the University of Utah, said, "I hope the information in the database will help scholars of religion and lay people alike begin to understand what it meant to be twice marginalized, a member of a minority race within a suspect minority religion." BYU student Andrew Pinaris says the database has been eye-opening.
So the thing I love about this website is it not only gives information about this not being a white religion, but it also, it's so much more than that. It gives stories and backgrounds about different people and kind of what it was like in that time to be a minority or a person of color.
The exhibit contains digital records of original documents, photographs, and fascinating biological essays.
It also shares statistics pertaining to gender, slavery, and locations of their conversion. However, the most compelling aspect of the database is the rich stories of African American members like Jane Manning James, who participated in early church women's organizations, and Elijah Abel, who served 3 missions for the church.
I like the things that I've been able to read just about Elijah Abel and other black Mormons and other pioneers. Personally, maybe not my ancestors, but the other culture of black people and black pioneers that have been out there.
The exhibit's archive contains nearly 40 biographies with the plan to add 200 more. The hope is for the project to help historians tell a more complete story during the faith's first century, one which includes members of color. Reporting for Newsline in Salt Lake City, I'm Cameron Hussein.
For those who have documents, photographs, or other supporting evidence for individuals in the database, you can contact the University of Utah's library through email at centuryofblackmormons@gmail.com.
If you haven't yet seen it, it's the last week to watch the film Jane and Emma in Utah. Newsline reporter Marion Klein is here with us today. Marion, what is all the buzz about?
The movie Jane and Emma is the first of its kind within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint community. The film, set in 1844, tells the story of an African-American Latter-day Saint woman and the unlikely friendship she had with the prophet's wife.
We tried to get on the boat. They wouldn't let us on account of our being black. So we walked.
You cannot just make a film about racial issues without doing a lot of hard work to understand it. And I don't understand it.
I wanted you to be my sister forever. I'm your sister till someone thinks I'm your girl.
Jane Manning was born a free black woman. She converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Connecticut in 1841 at the age of 28. Following her conversion, she and her family traveled to Nauvoo, Illinois to join the prophet Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints. On their travels, they were refused ferry passage because of their race and walked the remaining 800 miles to Nauvoo. Jane then lived in the home of the prophet Joseph Smith and his wife Emma, where she and Emma developed a strong friendship despite the racial climate of the time.
The production team that I worked with, my writer, producers, everyone that was creating Jane and Emma, we were a really unique group of women and men.
We wanted to make sure that we got Jane right, and we wanted to make sure that we maintained Emma's voice.
For Squires and the team, telling a story from the perspective of a Latter-day Saint black woman in the 1800s required a great deal of time, listening, and script revisions.
Draft number 10, draft number 15, we got through that. It was hard.
Honestly, it was a difficult process.
Difficult addressing racial issues, but also difficult delving into racism within the church.
Actually, we struggled with understanding each other.
But Squires believes the struggle had a purpose. She says it helped give her the depth and experience she needed to bring the story's tension to life on the big screen. Before the official release, they had a screening for Brigham Young University students with the Black Student Union.
Because it's too much pain, Lord.
BYU student Andre Johnson said the film showed
that the church was also started by black people as well. No one knows their stories. So oftentimes when someone raises their hand and they say something ignorant, in response, I raise my hand, I let them know that this is wrong. But this movie makes it in a way to where I don't have to do that anymore.
I think that Jane and Emma creates the uncomfortable conversation.
They found that people of all ages, races, and genders have connected with Jane.
When you relate to someone that you never thought you could relate to in such a deep spiritual way, there's a lot of good things that can come from that.
On the movie's opening day, the church and Bonneville Charitable Foundation agreed to match every Box Dollar office up to $40,000 to donate them to the NAACP Salt Lake branch. They reached the $40,000 that day.
Thanks, Marin.
JTM is well known in the Utah community.
Newsline reporter Sydney Storr sat down with rapper turned entrepreneur. Sydney, what makes him so unique?
JTM's EP, I Am Not a Rapper, reached #1 on the iTunes Hip Hop Top Albums chart. In addition to his career, his race and religious background are truly what have made him distinct.
I'm commonly known in this area for
for doing music.
James Curtin, also known by his musical pseudonym of JTM, is a hip-hop artist based in Provo, Utah. His rise to fame began in the very community that he also worships in.
I personally am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I have an interesting perspective because I'm actually half white, half black.
While there are many Latter-day Saint musicians, James has not only managed to hit #1 on the charts, but he's also been among the few minorities from the Latter-day Saint community to do so.
I think that I've become acclimated to just being in a minority. I actually grew up overseas in Russia, China, Taiwan, and Uzbekistan. So even being an American or a Christian person, I was always in a minority.
Even though he's adjusted to his situation, he still sees a demand for change.
I don't think people in this area are inherently racist in any way, at all. I think that they might be extremely ignorant to what it's like, and they might have conceived stereotypes based on, media or their experience.
James says that he personally hasn't encountered any roadblocks on his road to stardom, including his passion for entrepreneurship.
At least when it comes to entrepreneurship, they judge a business based on the products rather than the race of the person who runs it.
JTM also says that people need to start caring about racial issues. He also says that it's really important for people to step outside of themselves and see the world around them. Back to you.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you for joining us today. That's all we have for this special edition of Newsline.
For more coverage on the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission, you can join us right now on our internet live stream that's on our YouTube page, Newsline.
For all of you staying with us for the rest of the symposium, we will spend the next hour discussing the Kerner Report. Next, Julie Rose from BYU Radio joins us now.
Have a great day. Amazing things.
I learned so much.
Welcome to the BYU Radio studio in Provo, Utah. I'm Julie Rose, host of the daily news interview show Top of Mind, heard weekdays at 5 p.m. Eastern on SiriusXM Channel 143 and BYURadio.org. You're watching continuing coverage of Kerner Plus 50, an examination of race in America 50 years after the Kerner Commission report. The commission, which had been appointed by President Lyndon Johnson, blamed racism and systemic discrimination for fomenting frustration that led urban centers around the country to erupt in violent riots. White society is deeply implicated in the ghetto, said the commission's report. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. Today, 1 in 5 Americans believes racism is not a problem in the United States. That's according to a Pew Research survey released last week. And perhaps that explains why it's so hard for us to talk about race in America today. How can we talk about a problem not everybody agrees even exists? I'm joined in studio by LaShawn Williams, a professor of social work at Utah Valley University. She teaches and writes about cross-cultural interaction. Welcome, Professor Williams. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
When somebody in America today says racism doesn't exist, that it's not a problem at least, can you put yourself in their mindset for a moment and help us understand what's going on from that point of view?
Oh, for sure. The visible markers of de jure racism are gone. We are comfortably integrated through entertainment, through sports. Our schools are integrated. Our work environments are integrated. We're not seeing the blatant separation. But what we're also not seeing is the invisible separations that continue to divide us and are founded and contributed to by ongoing systemic racism.
So people who say racism is not a problem in America, are they defining racism differently?
Yes. They focus on racism as specific, intentional, direct, blatant, obvious acts. Because we are not seeing, or at least we weren't seeing, marches of white nationalists or Nazis or the KKK, it was then believed that racism was now not a problem. So because we're not seeing it the way that we're used to seeing it from the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, 1960s, then it, as it was exampled then, must no longer exist.
Give me an example of something that, an instance of racism that someone who believes it's not a problem is not seen. Like, what are they missing exactly?
Well, racism is a system of advantage based on race. Most of our isms, most of the nationalism, capitalism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, anything ending in ism helps us to remember that it's a system of advantage based on whatever the prefix of the ism is. And so racism is a system of advantage based on race. What we don't see is how racism was built on access to resources and how resources meant power. Power in our country and resources in our country is based in land. And land is where you live, and where you live influences where and how you go to school. Your schools then influence what types of job opportunities you have, and then your job influences where you're able to live, so that we don't see those invisible power structures that are heavily influenced by racism as a system of advantage based on race.
So, Professor Williams, you live in a predominantly white community. You're African American. How do you respond when someone says to you, well, America elected an African-American president.
Yes.
You're a successful college professor.
Yes.
Skin color doesn't matter. How can you say that it does matter when,
right.
when people like you can have the success that you have?
Absolutely. A number of well-intentioned white people will see me and President Obama as exceptions to a general rule. And when we focus on the exceptions, we then forget to look at the masses that are not President Obama, that are not African-American college professors, that are not African-American celebrities or athletes or actresses or actors. We then absolve ourselves from the responsibility we have to each other to make sure all of us are able to access opportunities in an equal way.
Tell me a little more about that. What is it that we're absolving ourselves of?
The responsibility to say, what if racism actually is a problem? Then what does that mean? That's the question that we don't know how to answer. That's the question that we're scared to discuss, because then we're personally implicated in the continuation of a system that we feel we did not put actively into place.
We're scared to discuss it?
Absolutely.
Is that one of the reasons why you think talking about race is so fraught in America, and so many people, white people, I'm speaking from that perspective primarily in this moment, are just afraid to bring it up? It's like, if I talk about it, then I might either say something wrong but you think the fear is deeper, that it's subconsciously we're afraid we're going to find something out that's really uncomfortable for us.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the things that a lot of my white friends struggle with is not knowing who your own heroes were who stood up against racism. You think about Bill Moore, the postman from Mississippi, who was on a 2 or 3 day walk that he wanted to walk from Mississippi to Washington, D.C. to deliver a letter to the president at that point in time, was killed by white members who supported the KKK because he was fighting against racial justice. And he was fighting not because racial justice was bad for black people, or racism and discrimination was bad for black people. He was fighting because racism is wrong. And that's a lot of the issue that I think we run into, is we think we should fight something because it's bad for someone else, as opposed to fighting it just because it's a wrong thing. Racism, white supremacy, those things are wrong because of how they influence people. But even if you're not around black people, or if you're not around people of color, you're not around folks that are negatively impacted by racism or oppression, you should fight it because those things are wrong and they go against your personal moral values. And I think we're scared to actually have that attachment to ourselves, that it being, this is a personal fight for me, whether any black person or white person or a member of the LGBT community actually benefits from my efforts. I'm fighting this because it's wrong, and I believe it's wrong, and I'm going to fight against it.
So how does a white person in America take that perspective that you just described and not come off as, oh, there's another white person trying to make this about them?
Oh, yes, to avoid centering yourself in the work in a way that is to say, let me get all of the attention and accolades and awards for doing this really good work.
So that's the distinction there? Tell me what this, like, this white
centering piece is. I'm doing it because, and again, it's a fear thing. I want to get it right. I want to do a good job. A lot of us want to do a good job getting rid of something. And the difficulty is, we're all surviving systemic oppression. There are no awards for survival. We shouldn't be in a place where we're even having to survive. So when you engage in the work, engage in the work because this matters to you personally. Whether anyone were to see you doing it or not, I think all of our historical figures, Malcolm X, MLK, Bill Moore, John Brown, a white man who was the man behind Harper's Ferry, he recruited his 6 or 7 sons to do a revolt against slavery, all white men, and he was hung for treason. I think being able to understand that John Brown did it because he believed slavery was wrong, not because he was looking for Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth or any other enslaved or free black person to say, hey, good job, John Brown. He did it because it was wrong. We have to understand that working for justice through merciful means, non-direct or direct, non-violent demonstrations and actions like that, those are the right things to do to get rid of wrong and harmful systems.
I mentioned that the Pew Research Center recently put out a survey that found that a fairly large percentage of Americans, 1 in 5, believes that racism is not a problem in America. And I would imagine that a lot of those people also would reject the idea of white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them are, I mean, I'm guessing here, but I imagine many of them are white.
Yes.
And they look at their own lives and they say, I've worked really hard for everything that I have. I've had a lot of hard knocks. You know, I don't have I'm not wealthy. I haven't had the, privilege is not a word I would associate with my life.
Correct.
As a working class American,
Yes.
for example.
Yes.
So white privilege is meaningless. Like, the color of my skin has never done me any favors. Explain what you think about that viewpoint.
Well, if 1 out of 5 people don't believe racism is a problem, that means 4 out of 5 do. So, if we're running into statistics that way, white privilege has become a very difficult buzzword for the work that we do in diversity and in inclusion work in higher education. We're always trying to adapt our language to bring as many people to the table for conversation as possible.
And white privilege is a toxic word that you try not to use when you're promoting
getting,
diversity?
For me, it's getting to that point because I recognize how much it turns my students off. So often what I will say is, people who were enslaved worked really hard also. Were they able to get the same benefits that others of us who were not enslaved and work really hard do? This is not about working really hard. This is about, do you have access to resources that benefit from your very, very hard work? And it's also a very difficult and entwined conversation about class and race. MLK quotes a historian who wrote the book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, and he talks about how when he was, imprisoned at some point in time for a demonstration or march that he was doing, he got to talking with the prison guards that were there who were telling Martin Luther King, you guys got to stop all this marching, just go along to get along and behave and everything will be okay. And Martin Luther King says, I engaged them about their families, about their schools, about their children. They told me how much money they didn't make, how they were going hungry, how their families were suffering. And MLK says, you should be out there marching with me. We're fighting against a very similar system, but the only thing that has me in here and you out there is because you believe you're better because you're white. And that's something that white people are told, especially where class is concerned. There's a movie coming out, Best of Enemies. It's based on the true story of the Durham community, Durham, North Carolina. An activist and befriends a white man who's a member of the KKK. The black woman is out doing voter registrations, and she ends up interacting with this white male who chooses to align himself with the KKK. And one of the turning points, spoiler alert, for this discussion about their friendship, their best of enemies, is when the white man realizes that when he's at Klan meetings, he is welcomed and embraced by his brothers. But when he is on the streets and sees those same bankers and lawyers and city councilmen, they cross the street to get away from him. When the system of privilege and power abandoned that white man, he recognized that he was aligned with the wrong people. It's a similar conversation here. Yes, your white skin may not have done you any favors, but are you willing to engage and to explore the fact that what if it has? What if your white skin was used to keep my brown skin out of places? And if that were true, none of it's saying that you're a wrong person. It's saying you're benefiting from a system that was set up long before you took your first breath. And because you have that privilege, you actually now have leverage. You have access to something that I don't have. And if you can make space for me to be where you are, there are ways that I can also probably make space for someone else to be where I am. And so our privileges now become power.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think a lot of people perceive the idea that if I acknowledge that I have benefited from white privilege, that I therefore must bear a burden of shame and guilt, that I should feel badly
right
about this thing I got that I didn't work for,
Absolutely.
that I was just born with.
Absolutely.
Does guilt have to come along with acknowledging white privilege?
Guilt, yes. Shame, no. Shame says that something about you is wrong and terrible and unworthy of respect, or unworthy and is unredeemable. Guilt says, I'm behaving in a manner contrary to who I really believe I am. Guilt will motivate you to make changes. Shame will not. And so this idea of a privilege shame, any of us can have it through skin privilege, through ability privilege, through class or educational privilege, through sexual orientation, gender identity, political, nation, any sort of privilege. There are so many identities that we have. All of our identities exist within us experiencing privilege and oppression. When we experience privilege and we feel guilty about that privilege, it just means, okay, what can I do to leverage this? Because privilege is it's not a use it or lose it kind of thing. I have it whether I leverage it or not.
Leverage it for what? Give me one specific example of someone, of what someone could do to leverage the privilege that has come with their color.
Who do you bring with you to access the same resources that you don't think twice about?
Like what?
Like school. I think a very easy area is the schools that our kids attend. One of the things that I will do, because I have class privilege that allows me during the workday to go and volunteer in my child's classroom, I tell the teachers, if there is a kiddo whose parent works and they can't come in, can I work with that kid? That's a simple way that I can leverage class, education, and time privilege that I have that other working parents might not have. It's an easy example. But a lot of us don't seem to think that we can do small, easy things like that. But we can, and it takes small, easy things to dismantle these systems of oppression that we all are living within.
I'm speaking with LaShawn Williams, who's a professor of social work at Utah Valley University. She teaches and writes about cross-cultural interaction. The Pew Research Center's recent survey found that views on this, whether racism is a problem, fall quite dramatically along party lines. So 24% of Republicans in this survey said that racism is a very big problem. That's 24%. Compared to 62% of Americans who believe that it's a problem, of Democrats in America who believe that it's a problem, so more than double.
Yes.
Why do you think that views on race would be tied up with politics at all?
It's our foundation of our country. From the 3/5 compromise that was settled that deemed our political representation for the North and the South, when the Southerners wanted their enslaved humans to count for their numbers and representation, to give them more representation in the Congress, the Northern representatives said, well, then we're going to tax you based on representation as well. Southerners said, no, we want the numbers representation, but their property so far as taxes are concerned. And a 3/5 compromise was made that had enslaved Africans considered 3/5 of a person for taxation and for representation. So race is at the foundation of our political history here in the U.S., and so there's no surprise that it will find its way into our current political environment.
Is there a reason, though, why you think today that there's such a divide? I mean, we know that we're more polarized than we have been politically in at least 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Democrats, people who identify as Democrats are, more solidly Democrat than ever before, and Republicans likewise.
Yes.
I guess a part of the question is, are we just, because we're just divided in general, like this also aligns with our views on race and whether or not it's a problem? I mean, is there something that's going on that's causing, Democrats to be more concerned about racism in America and Republicans to not be?
Well, race is one of the few things we think that we can see. I can look into a room and I can discern differences in phenotypical, stereotypical racial characteristics. And because it's part of our political environment and our political conversations, whether it's through dog whistle politics and code words that are used to say negative things about people, or whether it's very blatant discussions of claiming nationalism instead of using the word patriotism, we're entering a conversation that is drawing lines in the sand and creating these litmus tests for who is a real, worthy, respectable member of this society, who is a real American. And when you've had political shifts, one of the major conversations that will come up will talk about how Abraham Lincoln and others during that era were Republicans, and that's sometimes used as a conversation point to say why black people should be more Republican than they are Democrat, because Andrew Jackson was a Democrat and Democrats were racist at that point in time. What we failed to also discuss is the shift in party philosophy and party ideology that happened from the 19th century, from the Great Depression and on. And we fail to study our history. We fail to study how the Social Security Act of the 1930s included so many people, but it excluded agricultural and domestic workers, which were predominantly people of color. Black domestic workers and immigrant Mexican agricultural laborers were not included in the Social Security Act and did not benefit from the safety net. So if you follow the policy and you understand how we've enacted policies in ways that have created and continued and maintained division, then all you're seeing today is just explicit recognition of what has existed invisibly from our foundings up until now.
Professor Williams, how do you think the national discussion that we have been having for several years now about white police officers using violence against black men, often unarmed black men, how has that affected race relations among everyday Americans today?
It puts a lot of us in fear of each other. It puts a lot of us in a place where we feel like we have to prove our worth to each other before we can even engage in a healthy manner. It's unfortunate that we have these demonstrations happening within our communities, demonstrations of violence, demonstrations of resistance. People are asking to be heard. And Martin Luther King said a riot is the language of the unheard. It also goes back to how officers and law enforcement are trained to engage with people. For me, as a mental health professional, we know how important it is to de-escalate and to engage folks. More officers and departments are taking mental health engagement seriously, but it's a long process because of how we associate law and order through Richard Nixon's administration and crime and punishment as opposed to protecting and serving. What would it look like to protect and serve?
Do you think that I have wondered if, for example, with when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, and then also if we even think about the protests that Colin Kaepernick began, and NFL players kneeling during the national anthem in sign of protest, calling for more work to be done around both the issue of police force and racial discrimination in general. And then we see that conversation. It seems to me like oftentimes these issues where race is underneath it end up getting interpreted as being about something else, and that's the thing we focus on. So, for example, with the police force conversation, there are people, I'm sure, who feel like, I'm not going to support Black Lives Matter because they're anti-police officer. This is about not supporting law enforcement. Or, we saw that very clearly with the NFL protests. People saying it's wrong to kneel during the national anthem because that's disrespecting our country and disrespecting our soldiers, and not, or somehow like not thinking about it, or kind of ignoring the underlying race question that is beneath all of these, both of those cases. Why do you think that is? I mean, do you think that we're just afraid, again, of the race part, and so it's easier to define it as, I'm opposed to the kneeling because I don't believe that blacks should be discriminated against, but I'm opposed to the kneeling because it's against, because it's anti-patriotic?
Yeah, that's lazy patriotism for us, because if we want to see things only as we see it, in a way that absolves us of any sort of responsibility or commitment to community, that's what an alignment with white supremacist types of thinking, and the idea that white supremacy kind of changes the rules of the game whenever it sees fit, we're victims of that. If we're willing to all of a sudden make kneeling a symbol of disrespect, whenever there's an injured player on the field, the teams will both kneel until the injured player is removed. People kneel to show respect to deity and to leaderships and, kingdoms and whatnot. People kneel to propose. People kneel to worship. How does kneeling all of a sudden become a negative thing when I'm uncomfortable with why you're kneeling? That's what we're not getting to. And being able to say, I don't want black people being discriminated against, but I'm going to ignore the very examples of discrimination that you're showing me, is an incongruence. And it's a lazy civic engagement. It's lazy humanity for me to choose to see and value only the parts of your humanity that I think are important, as opposed to all of your humanity. I'd want the same thing to happen for me that I want for you. And that's why you'll see Black Lives Matter supporting police brutality against more than just black people.
Opposing, you say?
Oh yes, well, and they'll protest against police brutality when it's happening to non-black people. And so, but the other thing about it is we wait and we try to see if people are going to say white lives matter, then will they show up for white lives that are damaged and impacted by police brutality as well or not? There are some really interesting conversations that we have to play within these political gymnastics and these political games of switching the rules and this bait and switch, and it's like being in a house of mirrors at times. You don't know what you're walking into, because when you think you're walking in one direction towards unity, towards conversation, towards community and connection, it switches, and you run into a mirror and it's like, oh, I'm not getting the support and the help that I thought I was because you are uncomfortable.
How do we get that unity and conversation and support? And does it help to call out inadvertent racist attitudes, racial comments, to sort of say, hey, I know you don't mean it, but that's racist?
Yeah, it helps to call attention to those things. And relationship is at the heart of all of it. Because if I'm with someone that I really care about and I know that we can have that conversation, I actually might miss the first time they do it. I might be scared to engage it. But when I value the relationship, I might come back to it and say, remember that conversation we were having like 2 weeks ago and you said this, that, and the other? Did you know that it could have come off really racist, and it came off really racist towards me? Can we talk about that? Because I really don't think you intended it that way, but it really hurt me. And it's that one-on-one conversation. But it's also great if we can see it in leadership. There's a congressman running for office in Texas who was engaged about NFL players kneeling during the anthem. Beto O'Rourke, I think is his name. And he engaged the conversation so well by how masterfully he used history and how easily he implicated himself. He said, Colin Kaepernick and others are upset with people like me who are not doing enough and doing enough to speak up and to stand up against these things. And by owning it and discussing and talking his way through it, he set a really great example for other people who identify as he does to say, oh, well, if this is what it looks like for a white person speaking up against police brutality, speaking up against or in favor of Black Lives Matter, here's maybe how I can do it too. I don't know that white people feel like they have enough examples of how to do it that way, because the examples that they do have, JFK, Bill Moore, John Brown, all of those men were killed for standing up against and fighting against white supremacy, and that is daunting. It is also part of what many communities of color, Black, brown, and otherwise, have experienced, is our leaders being killed for standing up against power structures. And it's hard to dismantle the master's home with the master's tools, said Audre Lorde, but we've got to figure out ways to do this. We're 50 years later from a statement that you could have just read, and it could have been the entirety of this show. Why do we tolerate oppression? Why do we tolerate inequalities when we are the ones who really could change it?
LaShawn Williams is a professor of social work at Utah Valley University. Thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to those of you who've joined us online for this conversation. You've been watching special coverage from Brigham Young University of Kerner Plus 50, a conversation about race in America, 50 years after the Kerner Commission report. Coming up, Othello Richards speaks with film producer and author Tamu Smith and Brigham Young University history professor Cameron McCoy. They'll discuss what's been done since the Kerner Commission report and what hasn't been done. I'm Julie Rose. You can join me for Top of Mind weekdays from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern on Sirius XM Channel 143 or BYURadio.org.
Thanks for staying with us as we continue our discussion, Kerner Plus 50. I'm Othello Richards. Now today, we've been taking part in a discussion on race in America, along with the Global School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Morgan State University in Baltimore and the Reed College of West Virginia. Now here at the School of Communications at Brigham Young University, we have students viewing from the atrium of their Brim Hall building. Now joining me here on set are film producer and anchor Tamu Smith and BYU history professor, Dr. Cameron McCoy. Now, as I said, here we are now 50 years after the release of the Kerner Commission report. Let's talk about how far we've come in terms of what has been done and what has not been done. Now, Cameron, I understand for your dissertation, you needed to have a firm foundation on topics concerning race in America. As a historian, how would you answer those two questions? What has been done? What has not been done since Kerner?
Well, thanks for having me today. It's an honor, and it's good to see you again with us not being on the track together, with me chasing you typically most of the time. But what has been done is we've seen a definite focus on legislative matters. We've seen a focus on empowering social groups, and that has been great. However, what hasn't been done, despite what has been done, has been a change in attitudes, perceptions, as well as how we approach how these reform measures should help minority groups. And so even though things have happened and the policies have been set in place and the legislative reform has been landmark, we still are struggling with, as a nation, just how attitudes can change and how perceptions change, as well as teachings.
And so go back again, just backing up to what has been done. We know there was a case, Loving versus Virginia. Can you just go ahead and give us a little background on that case?
All right, 1967, it became legal for a black man or a black woman to marry a white man or a white woman. That was 1967. And so that was a landmark legislative decision that took place in the United States, which has allowed our nation to be even more diverse, right? And also has debunked many myths that we've had scientists try to say about people of African descent and who they are, and making a mongrelization of our society.
Right.
And then we have another case, Plessy versus Ferguson. I was talking about separate but equal, but is that the case? Is that really the case?
So this is in a case from 1896 in which separate but equal came to the forefront. And although separate, the equality was never there. And really, I would argue that it's equity. I would argue it's more of an equity thing rather than equality. But what happens is whites will have the exact same facilities, even though segregation is still in place in the law of the land, and blacks will have access to the exact same facilities. However, it's always an economic issue that comes into play. And so although the facilities may look the same and function the same, they're not being treated the same or maintained the same.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Tamu, your thoughts?
Well, you know, I agree with Dr. McCoy, and also I would just like to add that I would add that in today's society, that perception actually has this perceived perception has changed, and because people feel like they get it, that is the danger of it. They feel like things have changed, and so because things have changed, and because we're people of color are no longer being segregated out, like we're not being partitioned off in most cases, then they feel like things are better. And because they feel like things are better, they're no longer checking themselves. And that is dangerous because things have changed, but they're not better.
Things have changed.
We have not arrived.
I know that as a film producer, author, I mean, you know a lot about LDS church history. So here we are in Utah, obviously. Yes. Utah, there are a lot of members of the Church of Jesus Christ. There was a turning point in the church history. The church has some history with race. Can you talk to me about that?
Well, the history is, for those who are unfamiliar with it, at the beginning of the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormons, they allowed blacks in to have the priesthood. Black people were full-fledged members of their church. And then at the turn of the new leadership, then blacks were no longer given leadership opportunities and no longer given the priesthood because of the curse of Cain, the perceived curse of Cain. And so because of that, with petitioning, people petitioned against this school, BYU, because it's a school that is owned and run by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in 1978, black men were given the priesthood and they were given leadership opportunities, or that ban was lifted, and so moving forward, we've had. We just actually celebrated the 40th anniversary of blacks in the priesthood, or the reinstatement of blacks in the priesthood and blacks in the church, and so I think that. Was the question what has changed here?
Yes, what has been done, what has not been done.
What has been done? Well, I can tell you, first of all, what has not been done is sometimes when we get through a period, we don't want to look back and we don't want to talk about it. And there's this shaming that comes with anyone who wants to acknowledge or give a nod to the past or say, you know, this happened in the past, what is happening now? People, there's that shaming. So the LDS Church, after the announcement that blacks would have the priesthood and that the ban had been lifted, they didn't want to turn back and look back. They didn't want to acknowledge it. And because of that, there were lots of things that happened. And then moving forward, because we just celebrated our 40th anniversary, and when I say our, it's because I am LDS also. I'm a member of that church. But we just celebrated the 40th anniversary. And I think that as an organization, it was the first time in my lifetime that I've seen any organization in the United States collectively bring together the African diaspora and like all of Africa acknowledge that black people started somewhere and that somewhere was in Africa, and because of slavery we were, you know, dispersed to other nations, other areas. And so the LDS Church had a celebration where we all were able to come together. We started in Africa, and then it acknowledged slavery, it acknowledged our past, and here we are, like here we are today. So that was the first time that I've seen a celebration done of that sort. And I think that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is definitely in a position, if they wanted to start having those. It sparked a conversation, and we are able to start to move forward.
Yeah, I remember you know, all three of us are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Some of you out there have probably seen these missionaries on bicycles with their suits on. At one point, I was one of those missionaries. I served my mission in Oakland, California. And, you know, we have these beautiful temples. In Oakland, there's this nice, beautiful temple on the hillside.
Right.
And you'll be surprised how many times blacks approached me and said, I didn't know I could go up there. Which amazed me.
Didn't even know they could go up on the hillside.
They didn't know they were allowed to go up and onto the temple grounds.
But that's the same way when I'm a convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the temple was right near where I lived. And I didn't think I could go to it either. So that's a very common thing. And I grew up in the Northeast United States in DC and New York. So those are things that are common.
Yeah, so you have to try to think about where did that mindset come from? At what point did they start thinking that? But I felt that me serving in Oakland gave me opportunity to teach them. And yes, you are allowed. The church is open to members of all races.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And has always been open to members of all races. They just, not everybody could partake in the priesthood and the temple ordinances.
Yes. Now, Cameron, you talk about, you know, we've had our first African-American president, and now we're seeing this rise in white nationalism here. So in some ways, you're are we going backwards?
So this goes back to the two questions you posed right at the beginning. And they're apt to the Kerner Commission as well, which serves as an incredible blueprint if the United States would like to move forward in a more seamless way, in a more constructive way. But April 1865, in Appomattox, Virginia, there's the signing of the treaty to end the Civil War. And you have Lee and Grant there, Generals Lee and Grant representing the North and the South. And then you move forward 150 plus years later, and there are arguments over structure standing. And I want to be very clear about this. In the same light as 1967 and 1968, the reason why violence erupts is not because people are angry. It is because you have these symbols that represent white power and a white power structure. And that is what blacks are upset about. And so although we've moved forward, somehow the United States, being true to itself, and like most people, hey, remember where you came from. Remember your history so you never forget. But a lot of times that history can be toxic and tragic. And those are the parts that the United States, citizens of the U.S. need to move forward and beyond. So while it is heritage for some people, it is hate for others. And so that's what always has us get rebounded back to the past. And is always not, and the thing is this, all three of us understand this. The history of the United States has this deep fissure, this deep wound. And it has wounds upon wounds and scars upon scars. And that's based on racial inequities and racial inequality, which built the United States. And it's just so integrated, we will never get beyond that. But how we move forward, how we exercise reform measures and legislation is what will allow us to heal in a better way. But that wound is just so deep, it's just something you will always have. It's like when you have a bad knee, you always know when the bad weather's coming, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's switch gears for a second now to Black representation in the media. So as we've been hearing, the Kerner report was tasked with determining factors that led to the unrest in 1967. Now, one of those factors identified was the lack of adequate representation among people assigning, reporting, and editing the media coverage. So a survey this year funded by the Ford Foundation asked a national sample of 3,000 people whether they agree with this statement. And the statement was, hiring more racial minorities in the news media as reporters and editors would improve the quality of news. Now, 50% of white Americans responded yes, compared to 71% of African Americans, 71% of Hispanic Americans, 67% of Asian Americans there. So you see, African Americans, yes, they tend to believe we need to increase representation. Tamu, how would you have responded to this survey?
I would have responded, absolutely, we need to increase representation. And I also would say that, you know, it reminds me of Megyn Kelly. I mean, is that okay to bring up on the station?
Relevant in the news right now.
Okay, so first of all, there's two things I want to say really quick. When Dr. McCoy was speaking about racism in America, it would be crazy for us not to acknowledge the fact that we have a president of the United States, of this free country, who said that he ran on a ticket with the promise that he was going to make America great again, and also this week announced that he was a nationalist. Is that not alarming to us? Is that not alarming to people that he's a nationalist? Like that, you know, I'm not a globalist, I'm a nationalist. But does he not understand what that kind of, like what a nationalist is? Him being a white man and also announcing that he's a nationalist. I just wanted to just acknowledge that because it was driving me a little crazy here. But, you know, I think when I think about representation, I am a person that used to watch a particular channel every morning as I was getting ready and getting my kids ready for school. And then they brought over Megyn Kelly. And Megyn Kelly arriving meant the departure of Tamron Hall. And that was just really heartbreaking to me for several reasons, because Megyn Kelly came from a network where racism seemed to be the topic their jump off topic for me. And she announced on that channel that not only was Santa Claus white, but while she was at it, Jesus Christ was too. And never apologized. It was very offensive to many just many people. You didn't have to be black to be offended by that, because for several reasons. But she never apologized, never tried to make that right. And then they bring her over to this other network, NBC, and when I think about representation, I think about the departure of Tamron Hall. I started to look at other women on that had these national platforms, and you have Soledad O'Brien, but she comes in for the special, Blacks in America, for the special reports. She's not there daily. You have Robin Roberts on, is it ABC? You have Hoda Kotb on NBC still. And Gail, what is Gail's last name? Oprah's friend, Gail.
Yes.
We know your last name, yes. Gail, but we know you Oprah's friend too. But just looking at these people that have these platforms. Also, Joy Reid, she has this platform, and where is our representation at? And with 1 million Megyn Kellys, like 1 million women that look like her, white women get to see their representation all day long. Where is mine? And why did they have to bring that particular one over to replace Tamron Hall with, or meaning that Tamron Hall had to exit?
Yeah, and then we have this incident this week, the blackface comment.
Lord have mercy. And now she's gone, you know, now she's gone. And that was also inevitable because she kept getting away with those types of comments. It was inevitable that she would make another one.
Cameron, any thoughts on this?
When I looked at it, the one thing her apology interview was the one that really stood out to me. Where I think what was disturbing to me is I was fine with the apology. You knew it was going to come, right? It's a natural reflex to those types of things, especially when you're backed in the corner and you know I'm about to take a PR hit and a financial hit because of my comments. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to invite 2 black people on, a black male and a black female, onto my show. And I was okay with her apologizing. What really surprised me was just how so many people applauded the apology. Correct. It was a standing ovation. And I don't know why that bothered me so much, but it made me just recoil a little bit and think about, when do people start getting a pat on the back or getting applauded for making a very insensitive, bigoted, or racist comment about something and immediately or not terminated? If I had said something like that, or our incredible author and producer here, Tamu Smith, said something like that, we would have been gone within an hour. And I understand her emotional capital and physical capital for news organizations and channels in the United States, but that just really threw me off. And what she had on there were people educating her. I didn't feel that she had done enough education for herself to be able to speak solidly on that topic, that she had not sharpened her intellectual ideas about the topic. If that was me, that night, I would have been in my room studying everything and then come and said, this is what I have learned, because she says that. She says, sometimes I talk, sometimes I listen, and I'm paraphrasing, but she's like, yesterday I learned. And I would have just done that. I would have found every book and brought on experts about, look, what is it that made me do this? And she didn't highlight, I come from a background of privilege, which is why I made those types of comments, because she did say that. She said, well, where I grew up, and I knew that was coming, and I'm not
But you also don't get to make those mistakes. You don't get to do that. You could never make that mistake and think that you're going to show up on TV the next day to get to apologize. Like we don't get to do that. But also we understand that we have to apologize. Forgiveness isn't just given to us easily.
That's true. I mean, I always wonder how fast she would have learned had there been an African American on the set when that comment was made.
And there likely could have been.
Yes.
But she's not approachable, because when you are seen as the moneymaker, you actually who's going to say something to you if I'm not your boss?
I'm going to transition a little bit now to telling your story, or telling our own story. Why is it important that blacks tell their own story?
As a storyteller, I think that, and watching other people tell our story, oftentimes they tell the story that they know of us. And the truth is that in white America, in this America, people who don't look like me, or people who don't or have not been in situations where they have been oppressed, they don't have to know my story, but I have to know theirs. They don't have to interact with me. I interact with white people daily. There are some white people that never come in contact with a black person. And sometimes some of those white people that have never come in contact with a person of color are oftentimes the ones who want to tell the story that they read. And sometimes when they tell those stories, it's told from a stereotypical standpoint. And so I do think that it's important for us to tell our own stories, because we know the stories.
Cameron, you say there's some dangers in telling our own story?
Well, one thing, can I just add to
what
Tamu says is that's why 71% of African Americans and Hispanics said this is why the media needs to be represented in this way. The danger that comes in that is the three of us are here today. How many white Americans, white members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will say, well, I heard those three speak, so they represent everyone. So they told their story this way, and that's the danger of it. Because what will happen is we then will be viewed as, well, you were speaking for an entire group. The same way, the same pitfall Jesse Jackson fell into. the same pitfall that Louis Farrakhan falls into with the Nation of Islam.
Absolutely.
So all these people, the same pitfall that Al Sharpton falls into. And so when people say, well, no, they'll look at me, they'll look at Tamu, they'll look at you, Othello, and say, no, that's your leader. And we're sitting there saying, like, that's not my leader. I didn't even elect him. I don't even know him. I've seen him on television just like you. And I would ask this question then, who specifically is the leader for whites? Who specifically is the leader for Hispanic Americans? Who specifically is the Asian American leader that we all can look to? Right. But blacks are assigned because most people will see this prominent figure speaking out loudly, a lot of times inaccurately or incomplete.
Donald Trump.
And so that becomes the challenge right there. And so that's where I think some of the limitations are when it comes to speaking out and most of the time just not being completely informed.
Right.
Thank you. We're going to switch gears now, talk to a student. First of all, I'd like to thank all those who are watching at Reed at Morgan State University, at West Virginia University, and here in the Brim Hall building at BYU in the School of Communications. I'm joined now with Shy Andrea Jackson. Now, Shy, you are taking part in an internship in which you're putting together a newspaper and a website that is centered on minority-based news. Now, what inspired you to do this?
Well, see, I've been in Utah about 5 years now, and when I first came, I would get the weirdest questions, and I couldn't understand where these questions would come from. I would get asked, first thing, they don't know anything about me, are you an athlete? And I'm just like, why is that your first question? Why isn't it, what's your name, or where are you from? And I would get things like this all the time, and I couldn't figure out why. And so I started thinking about it, and in a state like Utah where the black population is so small, like almost non-existent, I realized that the only thing that they could know about me, personally, my race, is things that they get from media, that they see on TV, movies, and everything. That's the only thing that they have to go off if they don't have a realistic or a person that they can experience and learn from. And so I created the news-based website to give people a chance to both hear other people's story, to be able to connect and relate to us, so we stop getting those awkward questions that you're like, why would you ask me that? And also to highlight minorities in ways other than violence or entertainment in the news, another light for people to see that I'm not just an athlete, I'm an individual and a person.
I can tell you, I've got my fair share of awkward questions as well. Now you were telling me that your grandmother, she has a different perspective when it comes to race issues involving blacks and whites.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I was chatting with her the other day, and we were talking about racial issues, and she said to me, she was like, well, Shai, you know that if it wasn't for the few good white people that we had alongside us marching and fighting the cause, the black movement would have never gotten anywhere close to where it is today. And I know this, but like just hearing her say it really stuck with me. And I was like, yeah, that's true. And my grandma, she feels that the reason why, like almost like we're like backpedaling a little bit, because there's becoming this divide. Everyone wants to be pro-black or only pro-white. They want to identify with a side. And they're not actually focusing on the issues that are actually causing prejudice. They're not focusing on that anymore. And so by choosing these sides, we're just becoming more divided. Everyone just has their side and their perspective instead of actually taking on the problem. And so she explains that she doesn't think we don't even need these sides. We don't need them because when we were defeating prejudice and racism back in the day, it was non-minorities who was fighting that fight with us, and that's essentially how we got to where we are.
Now, you interviewed your grandmother yesterday, or did a Skype. Let's go ahead and hear what she said.
What we've done today, I don't think Martin Luther King would be happy with it, because he wanted to bring the nation together. But I've never been in such divided nation in my life. Unity was coming to America. Prejudices was being put down by blacks and whites together. And if we don't get back to that and try to unite our nation is falling apart.
It really moved me. I was like, man, Martin Luther King would be unhappy with this? Like, what? It's really special, and I really appreciate her insight, because when you talk about racial issues, I normally only get one side. They're either, oh, I'm so mad at white people for doing this, but they never actually understand that that's actually what's kind of causing divide. And I see things that way because I was raised in a family that's my grandma. That's my personal grandma. My mom was raised like that as well. And so I'm able to see another side. I'm not saying that I'm justifying anyone's beliefs. I still get offended and I still get frustrated for sure, no doubt. But I'm saying that there is another side, and you have to be willing to take on both sides and look at it from other people's views as well.
Looking from other people's view, you're telling me, so your grandmother recently visited you here in Utah for the first time. How did that go?
Well, so she came down, and she was so excited to visit Utah because she has never really been anywhere. She, just the type of family I grew up, I didn't even travel until I came here for athletics, and we started traveling every week for track meets, and I was like, oh, I've never been here. I've never been to a beach, but I was kind of trying to let my family know that, okay, you might get some abnormal things here, because we're kind of, people wonder, I don't know. And so I was like, you might get some stares. And so I kind of let them know that from the get-go, but until it actually happened, she didn't understand what I was saying. So we were at KFC, and we're just all having a good time. It's me, my mom, my stepdad, my grandma, just enjoying ourselves. I noticed that there was this white family sitting a couple tables down from us. And from the moment we walked in, I noticed it because I'm used to noticing it. From the moment we walked in, they were just smiling at us. And it wasn't like, oh yeah, you smile, you be polite, you say hi. It was like they were amazed with us. They were still smiling 30 minutes later at us. And my grandma, she leans over towards when we get ready to leave, and she's like, Shy, dude, why is this lady been smiling at me the whole time? It's almost awkward, because it's like, no, it's not. What's going on? What is she looking at? And so I'm just like, you see, that kind of thing kind of happens here in Utah. Because we're not the norm. They're not used to just seeing a black family, and they're wondering where we're from and why we're here and all of these things. But if you're not a black person, you're not going to ever notice that, and you're not going to ever experience that. And so it's definitely interesting. She was like, it made me feel special, which is not how I would have reacted. I would have been like, that made me feel awkward. I didn't like that. But my grandma was like, oh, I felt like $1 million, because she was amazed at me. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting take.
Yeah. Then lastly, we'll talk about, Brigham Young University, like many other universities, has a black student union. Mm-hmm. It's open to individuals of all races. Here at BYU, you said there is one white male that attends. And you talked to him about why.
Yeah, my friend Hiram, he's awesome. He's like a prime example of what I was saying earlier, that when I'm around Hiram and he's at BSU, he's placing himself as a minority. This is what us as minorities, black people, to speak for myself, I'm trying to get away from being a minority every day, because I'm living that life every day here on campus, every day here in Utah. But Hiram purposely places himself as a minority in our BSU. And I was just interested in why he decided to do that, because we're like, oh, we don't like that feeling. And he feels completely comfortable and at ease when he's with us. And so I asked him, I was like, do we make you feel like a minority? Do we make you, I wanted to know if, it was two-sided. Do we also make you feel at BSU like you don't belong there? Because that's how a lot of people say that it makes them feel here on campus and in Utah, being a black minority. And so his response was pretty interesting.
So you have a take there with Hiram.
My ancestors were pioneers. His ancestors were slaves. And seeing that our family history, our current life situations are so different, but yet we ended up in the same place. I don't go to BSU because, I want to be with all the black kids. I go to BSU because friends, not as my black friend.
So your concluding thoughts there?
Yeah, I totally think I think people like Hiram, like to me, when I look at Hiram, I'm just like, okay, he realizes that the first thing he notices isn't that we're a different color. He notices that we are people. We're both humans. We're both at BYU studying. And a lot of people, I feel like the first thing they notice about me is that I'm a different color, and then they start thinking about how I'm different from them. And that's why we cannot connect, because they just started off with the differences. But when I'm with Hiram and when he's with us on campus and in our events, like he wears Black Lives Matter shirts, and people always look at him like, why are you wearing that? And he feels completely comfortable. I don't feel like he's trying to assimilate to become black. He's being himself, and we're all normal because we're people. Just treat us all the same. There's a quote that I just watched the Hate U Give movie, and there's a quote on there, and it says that white people thought they were making a difference in black people's lives as well. And it just really moved me.
Thank you so much. It's always great to get a student's perspective, because now our students now are tomorrow's leaders as well. So thank you, and good luck with your internship and your special project that you're working on there, Shai Andrea. And so, we'll now be joined, Tamu and Cameron. First of all, the Ford Foundation conducted a survey. In the survey, the question that they asked was, do you think media portrays African Americans more positively, more negatively, or the same as reality? Now, more positively, whites responded 18%, blacks 13%, Hispanics 18%, Asians 12%. Okay, portrayed about the same, the media of African Americans, whites 36%, blacks 25%, Hispanics 32%. Now, this last one there, do you think the media portrays African Americans more positively, more negatively, or about the same? So more negatively, we have white Americans 46%, African Americans, believe it, 62% of the time they're portrayed negatively. Hispanic Americans think about this, 50%, Asians 50%. When you see this, I mean, what are your thoughts as we talk about media portrayal of African Americans?
I don't believe anyone's lying or anyone feels that their representation is incorrect. I always like to lead off with that, because they're not. It's their reality. It truly is. It is your reality. And all we need is, if blacks are telling whites this, believe us. Just simply believe us, because we're living it. But whites are also telling us, well, this is what we do not see, and that is their reality. They're not incorrect, but the media is able to splice and cut what exactly it would like to highlight. We see that in movie portrayals. And one of the things that I had a conversation with someone, I said, one of the negative things is that I said, if you were a movie star, Cameron, would you ever dress up like a woman, like Tyler Perry with Medea, or how Larry Johnson used to be grandmama in basketball, things like that? I said, no. I said, because I believe it would fill a stereotype. And I said, and I don't want to play to that, because it's negative. I said, and that is why I truly do believe Black Panther was such a success, because its portrayal of this fictional modern day king was exactly, at no time was he compromised, at no time was he unyielding, at no time did he fit an American stereotype. Now, I do know that this is in the fictional nation of Wakanda that has never been conquered by white colonists. I do understand that. But that portrayal was powerful in so many communities, so powerful that I remember just seeing Asians dressed up like T'Challa. I saw everyone just dressed up like him, running around saying, well, eat Bombay, and then running down and going Thanos. But I think it's important that we see that was a positive representation. And if we could have more of that, and when I say we, I mean African Americans could have more of that, you would see this tide shift, because that too opened up an incredible discourse within our nation, which is still going today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Tamara, you have some thoughts on this?
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with Dr. McCoy. I think that, like he said, when we tell you that something is happening, believe us. But also, I think that it depends on I think that sometimes when white America is looking at a television show or even the news, like when we say media, I'm thinking all media platforms. But and for this, I'll say television. We watch How to Get Away with Murder last night. And, you know, you have the star of the show as an African-American woman. But also, when I look at that, I'm like, well, I'm not a killer. She's also an attorney. She's, you know, she has all of these different things happening and going on. And so if I'm looking at that and somebody comes up to me and they think that I'm equal to, I can't even remember her name right now.
Viola Davis.
Viola Davis, yes. I'm thinking her character though. But Viola Davis and How to Get Away with Murder, I'm not an attorney. I'm not a law professor, and I don't have students that are helping me bury bodies. And so that could be seen as a negative stereotype to me, because she's elevated, but also she's elevated in doing negative things.
And there's this underlying current of her being a criminal. Of
her being a criminal, yes, even though she is an attorney and above the law. And so, you know, but I do think that movies like Black Panther and movies like my movie Jane and Emma, you know, that we are trying to buck those stereotypes and really just tell our story. And I remember when Black Panther came out, and I remember white people reading a couple of forums and Facebook posts and even some newspaper articles where white people were saying, I don't get it. Black people are dressed up and they're running around. And I'm like, Star Trek. You do get it. You don't want to get it, but I know you get it, because Star Trek, you have all of these other shows. What is it? The Warthoffs or whatever. What is it? See? No, anyway. Yeah. Anyway, it's the little boy with the glasses and
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter. Yes. Harry Potter. So people dress up and they choose a team. That's not even real either. And so we get it. We just try to act like we don't get it. And I think that sometimes those of us people of color, we are in a position to where we have to understand whiteness. Again, they don't have to understand us. And when we get the backup of white people solidifying what we're saying, that's when we're believed.
Too so much. I mean, we could sit up here and talk for the next 2 hours, but
really,
unfortunately, we are out of time. So thank you to our guests, Cameron McCoy and Tamu Smith there. Also thank you to our audience who have been watching online. This is the final session of the Kerner Plus 50 Symposium, co-hosted by the Global School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Morgan State University in Baltimore, at the Reed College of West Virginia in West Virginia University, and here at the School of Communications here at Brigham Young University. So thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.